I invite you to ponder this question with me. What in this life can bring you complete happiness, happiness that is permanent and true? And when the dust of life has settled, one can proclaim and say with joy and thanksgiving, I am blessed, I have been blessed, and I will be blessed. What brings you happiness that's permanent and lasting and true? Recently, in the January 2010 Guidepost, there was a story, an article written by a woman named Lori Snyder, a 52-year-old from Bayfield, Wisconsin. And Lori had a dream that she would climb the 7 summits in the world. She would climb all 7 of the highest mountains in the world. And her last mountain that she would ever attempt would be the highest one, Mount Everest, which stands 29,035 feet above sea level. And by the time she came to trying to complete her next to the last journey of Mount Kantunga, she found that she woke up one morning and half of her body was paralyzed. And because of the paralyzation in her body, she went to the doctors. About a year before she was to make this climb up to the next highest mountain, which is over 22,000 feet above sea level. And the doctors came with their diagnosis. And it was devastating news for her. Something that most of us really would not want to hear. The doctors told her, you have multiple sclerosis. You will never walk again, but the disease may go into remission if you do the right things and take care of the right kinds of treatments. The thoughts in her mind began to run all over the place, but I have not yet completed my dream of climbing all 7 of these mountains, she thought. I'm close, but I'm not close enough. She stated this: my identity was centered around the idyllic Rocky Mountain High lifestyle. I was a first-grade teacher, married, living in a beautiful house. I skied, I hiked, and worked out. I would never be able to do any of these things in a wheelchair. My friends were outdoorsy types. None of them had a serious illness. How could I tell them? What would they think of me? A week after she had been given the diagnosis, Lori went out and she tried to ski alone, all by herself, just testing out, trying to defy this news that was given to her, this illness that she had just become aware of. She nearly killed herself trying to ski alone. And so soon she decided to start the treatments that were necessary, that the doctors had prescribed. But she never ever told her friends what really was happening to her. She said, I never stopped dreaming of climbing a Katanda. And as the date was coming closer and closer, it made it seem like it was more and more possible that I could climb this mountain in spite of what I knew was going on in my body. And so she did. She, her father, and another young woman who was 35 years old began that ascent 18,000 feet one night, Lori laid asleep in the bed, listening to the 35-year-old as she struggled, coughing and breathing because of the altitude at which they had reached. The next morning, Lori and her dad got up and they began the day of climbing, only to discover after they had gotten so far up the mountain that now her dad could not continue because of the altitudes. And her dad had always been the one who inspired her. He had always been her faith guide. He was always with her when she did these climbs of the various summits. And he now had to go back home, back down to the base, because he could not continue the climb. And she had to decide, do I go back with my dad, or do I go on up the mountainside? And her dad looked at her and he said, Lori, you can do this. You can do this alone. Go for it. Go for it. He encouraged her to continue on the journey. And so she began to climb, and she reached to the height of 19,700 feet in freezing conditions, sometimes with blinding snow, carrying her supplies and her secret about MS. And after a day of rest, as they got to that plateau of 19,000 feet, the next morning they began once again to climb the difficult climb. It was difficult. The mountains were slippery, rocks were slippery, the visibility was almost near zero. But her guide, urging her, said this: take 30 steps, pause, and then take 30 steps more. But don't stop. Anything less than the 30 steps would cause you to become tempted, too tempted to stop, to sit down, and to give up. And so Lori kept following the instructions of her guide. Take 30 steps, a brief pause, and 30 more steps. And as they kept inching along up this mountain, 30 steps, a brief pause, and 30 steps. Finally, she found herself reaching closer and closer to the top of Mount Agatonga. And she had conquered finally the mountain. She had reached the summit of the mountain. But more than reaching the summit of the mountain, she had conquered her fears that she would never, ever be able to complete her dreams, the challenges of her life of muscular dystrophy, of multiple sclerosis. She had challenged herself, and she had gotten victory. And so why do I tell you this story this morning? It's because our passage this morning, Jesus too takes his disciples, his followers, and he takes them up a mountainside, urging them to continue in their journey. Our faith is like a journey that's going up a mountainside, and our ascent is getting us closer and closer and closer to God. But we find that as we make that mountain climb, life is not going to always be a bed of roses. We're not always going to see and hear good news. We're not always going to feel the presence of God with us as we make that climb. But if we take that climb 30 steps at a time, brief pause, another 30 steps, you and I will be entering into the kingdom of God. And so Jesus is teaching his disciples as they climb this mountain and get to the plateau. What are the 8 principles of a life shaped by God's reign. We heard it in the text. The very first one says, blessed are the poor in spirit. But most of the time, people, when they hear that passage, they easily dismiss it. Because what comes to mind easily is Luke's version of that. Blessed are the poor. He leaves out the word, blessed are the poor in spirit. And so we hear that and we think, well, I'm not really poor. I'm kind of in between. I'm not rich, I'm not poor, I'm comfortable. So maybe that doesn't apply to me. Or we think, blessed are the poor in spirit, or those who are suffering with some kind of mental illness or mental depression. But I don't think that's what Jesus was talking about either. So, what does he mean by the poor in spirit? The Greek language has a variety of words, and we lose that sometimes in the translation. But let's try this word. Blessed are those who humble themselves. Humble their spirits in the presence of God, recognizing that they need God every day, every moment, as they make this journey up this hill. That's the first step. Humbling ourselves. That's the hardest step, I think. Because sometimes I even get caught in my own self, trying to do it for myself, rather than letting God do it. It's necessary for you and I, as people of faith, to take that first step. That step of humbling ourselves before God, letting God be that strength, that hope, that presence, that love, that grace, that forgiveness, that whatever we need in our lives. That first step becomes the hardest step. It's like McDonald's in our lives. It's like the sign. We see the golden arches and we know there's something to eat. When God sees humility in our lives, God knows there's an opportunity. There's an opportunity for us to be blessed